Last time that I went to Great Sand Dunes National Park, one idea for an image really popped into my head. Now, if you've ever been to these dunes, you'll know just how massive they are. If all you want to do is climb the tallest one, it'll probably take at least an hour, and that's if you find the best route. Now, for my photo, I wanted to include a giant dune and mountains in the background, lit up at sunset with plants in the foreground. My initial plan was to do some scouting at sunrise, then film part of this tutorial and hopefully take a good photo at sunset. Now I'm going to put up a map. I wanted to do everything from this location. It's not a common spot to go on the dunes, but it looked like it would give me a good angle for sunset and nice side lighting on the mountains. So tip number one is don't park so far away from where you want to take pictures. I ended up parking in the main lot right here before sunrise, and I didn't realize just how much of a walk it was going to be to my destination. In the end, I had to turn around long before I got to the right spot. Luckily, at sunset, I found a much better place to park, and I did make it to where I wanted to be. I even got roughly the photo that I had in mind. So, here's how I did it. I think this spot looks pretty good. It'll still be a long walk, but at least this time I'll be going to the right dunes. Right now it's about 4 o'clock and sunset is at 7:30. So hopefully that should give me more than enough time to find a good spot and start taking pictures. So let's talk about camera settings. Now this is actually a pretty straightforward shot. I'm shooting from a tripod so I can easily use base ISO, and of course I'm shooting RAW like always. Now the first step for me is focusing and aperture. So in this case, I prefer that both the foreground and the background are equally sharp. I don't have any main subject that I want to prioritize. And in order to do that, I have to focus at a spot called double the distance, and I'll show you what this means. First, let me take a sample photo. Now, as you can see, at the bottom of the frame are the closest objects in the photo, and those are these shrubs right here. And I need them to be just as sharp as the background in order for this photo to have as much depth of field as possible. So in this case, I estimate that they're probably about 2 meters or 6 feet away from my camera. So I'm just going to double that distance. And I need to find an object that's about 12 feet away from my camera and focus on that. Now both my foreground and background are equally sharp to one another, but they're not yet maximally sharp, and that's because I haven't selected my aperture. Now in this case, I'm shooting at about 20 millimeters. I'm going to select an aperture of f9, and that should give me just the right amount of depth of field. Now, depending on the subject and depending on how close your foreground is, you might need a different aperture than f9. Personally, with a full frame camera, I tend to range anywhere from f5.6 to f16, depending on the lens and how far away my subject is. So now I've selected my aperture, I've selected my ISO, I've focused properly. The only thing left really is shutter speed. And at this point, I'm just going to pick a shutter speed that gives me the right exposure. It's a pretty high contrast scene, so I want to make sure that I don't overexpose any highlights. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at my camera's histogram. So here is the histogram for the photo that I just took, and as you can see, not very much of the histogram is bunched up to the right. It's actually a somewhat underexposed photo. So I'm going to do maybe a stop more exposure than this. Now as you can see, the histogram is fairly far over to the right, but it's not overexposed in any of the color channels. If I go only a third of a stop more, then the blue channel starts to blow out just a little bit. All right, now you've basically seen my entire start to finish process for camera settings, and that means that we're at the exciting part, and that is waiting for the light and then running around like crazy when it arrives. So I'm going to take this camera and move it to a distant dune, kind of overlooking this general area. And I'll do my best to stay within the frame while I'm taking pictures. If everything goes right, then I'll be able to show you this time lapse of me taking pictures at sunset. So it all paid off. The light was pretty nice and I got the shot that I had planned. The only real problem is the photo I took is not actually my favorite from that day. Instead, jump back to sunrise. My failed scouting mission to the west side of the park meant that I was actually in a great spot for the early light. Now, I had only planned to capture some time-lapse footage for this video, and I had just started filming when I made the decision to stop my time-lapse in place. At this point, I abandoned the plan, grabbed my camera, and started taking stills. 7 minutes later, I got this photo. And I'll just note that I used exactly the same techniques as the sunset photo, so all of that info still applies. But in my opinion, this is the shot that wins out, even though it wasn't the one that I had planned. Now, you might have a different preference. Maybe you like how the sunset photo looks instead, and that's perfectly fine. But for me, there's something very emotional with this black and white shot that the sunset image doesn't quite convey. Maybe it's the difference in the clouds, which were darker and more intense at sunrise. It could just be the simplicity. It's a line leading into the background, very few distractions. Whatever the reason, the takeaway is that my favorite photo from this day is not the one that I expected. I shouldn't even have been at the location that I took that picture, and when I was, my plan had been to film rather than take photos at all. And I guess that's tip number 2. Planning can be great, but usually flexibility is more important. Don't get caught up in the photo you plan to take, or you might overlook something even better. And this also applies when you're looking through your photos later. The best one might be completely unexpected. Now let's do a rapid-fire post-processing session to show my complete editing process for the black and white image starting from the raw file. Now, I'm going to use Lightroom just because it's the most popular, but the same techniques apply to any common editing software. So here we go. Alright, I've opened the image in Lightroom's Develop module and I'm ready to start editing it. Now, the first 2 changes that I want to make are simple. I want to convert this photo to black and white, and I want to crop it down properly. So the first step is to convert it to black and white, and then cropping it because I think that the sky takes up a little bit too much space. To me, the main subject here is the sand in the foreground. So after I've cropped it down to about the right amount, I still think that I need to rotate this image. It looks a little bit off kilter to me, maybe 0.7 or so. And now the crop and rotation look good to me, so I'm just going to start editing the photo in Lightroom's basic panel. Now the first thing is exposure. I think this photo is perhaps a little bit too bright, not much, but I'm going to darken it just a hair, and it definitely needs more contrast. On top of that, I almost always recover the highlights and the shadows, even in photos where I'm going to add contrast. And in this case, I am by increasing the whites and decreasing the blacks. I also want to add a little bit of clarity. Now, clarity is one of those ones that you should be very careful with, because if you go beyond even plus 20, things can start to look really fake. Not always, but often. And dehaze is even more sensitive. I'm only going to go to plus 5 on that. And now I really like this tone curve edit, in particular the light slider, which has a really nice effect in my opinion. So I'm going to increase it to about plus 17. And I do think that I should crunch the shadows just a little bit, so I'm going to decrease those to minus 5. Now the photo is starting to take shape, and I'm mostly done with the broad global adjustments. But there are still plenty of little things that need to be fixed. First off is the sky. Right now I think that the sky has too much contrast, and it's also too bright. So I'm going to create a gradient adjustment and try to fix both of those issues. First off, I will decrease the contrast so that there's a little bit less separation between the clouds, and then I will decrease exposure correspondingly. To me, that's a definite improvement. On top of that, I'm going to create another gradient for the bottom right of the image, which in my opinion has a little bit too much contrast and clarity. So I will decrease both contrast and clarity. And then closing out of that, there's still one area that I think definitely needs a local adjustment, and that is the top of this ridge. To me, the top area here just doesn't work very well because it blends in too much with the sky. So I'm going to create a radial adjustment and position it right there. And here I'm going to actually increase the white slider, in part because this increases some of the whiter areas on the sand dune itself, making them feel more defined, but also because it increases this brighter area right behind the sand dune near the horizon. And on top of that, I'm going to increase contrast just a bit, and I think that that area is slightly too dark, so I'm going to increase the exposure. And now I've done basically all of the larger local adjustments that I plan to do, but there's still two smaller areas that I want to give particular attention to. And those are these bushes right here and these shadows right here. To me, they're distracting for the same reason. They stand out too much compared to their surroundings. So I'm going to start by adjusting the plants on the right-hand side. And to do that, I'm going to create a new brush and zoom in. And I'm also going to just press the O key so that I can see exactly where I'm painting. And then I'm going to toggle the O key again. And now I'm going to decrease the contrast, decrease the highlights, same with the whites, and same with clarity. And I might just increase the shadows a tad bit so that they don't have dark halos around them. And other than that, I'm going to zoom out, and to me that looks pretty good. Now the other area that I want to create a new brush is over here on these darker shadows. So I'm going to paint right there. Again, press the O key to kind of toggle what I'm seeing. Paint right there, and paint right there. So, decrease contrast, increase shadows, increase blacks, and I'm actually also going to decrease the highlights again so that they don't have halos around them. And now I'm going to close out of that and zoom back out. So at this point, I just want to take a moment to analyze the photo, see if there's anything that I missed earlier that I should edit again right now. To me, this looks almost exactly like how I wanted, especially considering that it's such a quick edit. I really don't have anything to complain about right now. So at this point, I'm happy to consider this photo done. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. With Photography Life, I'm Spencer Cox, and I will see you next week.